Welcome to Mentoring in Real Life, where we talk about what it takes to find and be a great mentor. I'm Angela, and together with my co-host Bill, we know the power of mentoring and what it can do in your life on both sides of the table. If you're interested in learning tips, tricks, and hearing stories about mentoring, you're in the right place. Come join us. Hey Bill, how you doing?
Angela, I just never been this happy, even though it has been a minute since we did one of these.
It has been a minute. That's so true. We've been really navigating some challenging schedules between work and personal travel between the two of us. But I'm glad to see you today.
And by the way, how are you doing?
I'm tippy-tappy. Couldn't be
Awesome.
happier. Couldn't be as happy as I am right this second.
Got it.
So speaking of this work travel, recently I was coaching a team where there were people very early in their careers. I'm talking like less than 4 years in their careers in the same room as people who had decades of experience, but the whole team was outlined and identified to be leaders at the site, at the job. And in many instances during the team coaching engagement, one of the things that I noticed were, young people had this mindset that they needed to shift in order for the team to progress further, faster. So today we're tackling how to approach career growth when you're identified as a leader early in your career, and what training, what mindset, what patterns will set you up for success. You'll never guess this, Bill, but our first piece of advice is not to show up with, I get this attitude.
Yeah, I think being cocky is not any advice that we would ever give, really. It comes more naturally to some than others, but I would recommend that you never presume that you're the smartest person in the room. Really, and this applies no matter what level you are in your career. Yeah, always being willing to listen and learn is going to be a key to anybody's growth. So if you're identified as a high potential leader early in your career, the goal isn't just to become better at your current job, it's to develop new skills that are going to be needed to succeed at progressively larger levels of responsibility. The most valuable mentoring and training tends to fall into a few categories. So first, I would seek mentors at different levels, not just one. You want to be able to talk to a manager who can help you excel in your current role. That's great. And this is best if it's someone who can catch you performing your current role and offer you feedback. But you also would like to have a senior leader who can explain how strategic decisions are made. Perhaps they invite you to strategic decision meetings or have you shadow them. I mean, I think you've done that or have stories about that.
I do. Yeah, actually, my very first assignment, one of my roles in that first assignment when I was in uniform in the Air Force was as part of essentially the Commander's Action Group. And we would do things like develop out the briefings that he was delivering to Secretary of the Air Force level kind of, folks to try to talk about why we needed the money that we needed, what it was that was important to the program and so forth. And so at the time, I didn't realize how impactful that role was for me because I was sitting in on the executive level meetings, so I would understand what his pain points were, how he thought, how he considered resources, what kind of questions he asked of the team, and I would help build out these strategic level briefings for him. And so it was essentially shadowing him on a daily basis because it was part of my role. And then he would take me to the Pentagon and be with him. I was essentially his note taker as we prepared these briefings to go more senior and senior in the organizations. We did things like media day for how we would talk about the program to the media. I had all of this exposure that it wasn't until years later I really realized and appreciated how I, very early in my career, got a chance to see how strategic thinkers and executives think about cost, schedule, and performance and how they advocate for more resources. And it turned out to be invaluable. It was an invaluable experience for me that really helped me later on in my career advance faster.
I don't doubt it for a second. I've had plenty of opportunities to mentor folks who were relatively new in their career. And so this is a constant theme that comes up that gets solved by that shadowing thought that you just had. And that is people sitting there wondering why people make these crazy decisions that they just don't understand. And they obviously don't understand how it works at our level. Why are those knuckleheads at the senior levels making decisions like that? And I would certainly acknowledge that sometimes those decisions are made because they don't understand what's going on at the lower level. But often those decisions are influenced by things that the people who are working at the individual contributor level aren't seeing. And so all those people at the senior levels, they have bosses and they have customers, and they make decisions sometimes because that's what's necessary to move the ball forward at that level, even if it's not exactly what you would think it should be at a lower level. So I would agree with you. It's invaluable to sit in on those meetings and see what those interactions are like, because it gives you just so much of a better base for the decision making that goes on and how you can help your bosses make decisions and get the things that they want. You got to understand what the customer or the other people in the meeting need out of those decisions. And that's an invaluable set of skills that you learned very early in your career, and sort of fits well within this particular podcast about how do you want to grow those sets of skills so that you're going to be better prepared as a leader.
That's right. And we'll get more into learning more about different parts of the organization, how the business is run, stretch assignments and so forth later in the podcast. But who else would you recommend be part of a person's group that they seek advice from?
Sure. So we've talked about, managers and senior leaders, but also you'd like to be talking to your peers, a peer mentor, somebody who's much closer to your level, but who can offer you some honest feedback and help you navigate any of the challenges that you're experiencing, because maybe they have a little bit more experience than you, or a different set of experiences that could contribute to your own growth. And so finally, I would say, if possible, you'd also like to get somebody outside your direct reporting line who can give you some objective career advice.
Absolutely. This actually reminds me a little bit of a concept that we've talked about in the past, where people get essentially their own personal board of directors, that we've mentioned in the past, or personal board of mentors. And it's so important. It's just one way, again, to help gain experience and advice from people, not just within your chain of command, but people who can help with your career growth that are outside of your direct line of supervision. So another thing that we recommend, and you started this, Bill, by talking about really understanding the different elements of the organization, but learn how the business actually works, right? So technical excellence gets you noticed early, but broader business understanding often becomes more important as you advance. So focusing on the disciplines outside of your current role, so you at least have a basic understanding of business acumen. So for example, get a broad understanding of finance and budgeting, get an understanding of strategy and competitive analysis. How does the market look and your competitors look? Get an understanding about operations, about process improvement, about sales and the customer experience, about data analysis and decision making. When you get an understanding, this breadth of experience, that just makes you more available for opportunities within the organization that you might not have had if you just keep your head down and focus on your technical individual contributor role specifically. Bill, what do you recommend if people don't have the luxury of watching the business sausage get made in their current organization?
Well, many organizations also offer leadership development programs or tuition assistance for business courses. Most people were likely trained in some specific technical skill, engineering, finance, or a trade. And when you do these well as individual contributors and you're highlighted as a future leader, your growth is going to depend on the understanding how the business sausage is made, or rather how the other aspects of the organization all help the business as a whole. in addition to that, you're also going to make or break your career depending on how you show up as a leader. There's a lot to learn in each of these areas, and training courses can help you get there. Even if you don't have if you don't get a specific degree, you should consider maybe certificate programs to get a little depth and understanding in business operations or leadership. Having appreciation for functions across the entire organization is going to help you make much better decisions as you help the business grow. All right, so that's some of the basics about the business. But then, what about as you're growing, as a leader? You're obviously going to have to take on. If I'm going to be a leader, that probably means I'm going to be in charge of other people within the organization, and I'm going to grow that set of responsibilities. Well, okay, then you better start developing some team management skills before you have the direct reports. You don't want to wait till the first day on your job as a supervisor. Maybe I should take some courses on this kind of stuff. And so there's lots of things that you can practice long before you're a supervisor. You can start with giving and receiving feedback. We just talked about having peer mentors that can provide you feedback. If you're going to be a leader, if you're going to have people working for you, you've got to get good at this. And we've talked about it in other podcasts. It's not just for the people up or down your chain of command. If you're an individual contributor, you can receive feedback from your supervisor or higher levels and also your peers. You're going to have to learn something about coaching others. And so I didn't realize the nuanced aspects of coaching until much later in my career. And certainly as a certified coach, you understand this better than most. But it took me a long time to figure that part out, the difference between directing people and coaching people. And there's significance in that. And again, there's all sorts of coursework and all sorts of discussions that we've had that you can have with other training systems as well. You have to learn how to delegate effectively. You're going to have to learn how to resolve conflict. You're going to have to learn how to run productive meetings, and you're going to have to learn how you're going to influence things, even if you don't have formal authority. And so those are all things you can and should be working on long before you're managing a big team. So even if you're just leading a project and you're not even a designated project manager, but you're leading aspects of a project, or you're mentoring interns or new employees, all of that can also provide some very valuable experience. So I would tell you, if you're a young person and you're listening to this and that's making you uncomfortable, my advice is lean into it. Get used to that discomfort.
Absolutely. I have seen this time and time again, not just as a leader, as I'm sure you have as well, but also as a coach, especially, that a person who is excellent at their particular technical skill becomes a leader of a team and fumbles at those skills. A person can read books, articles, listen to podcasts for hours, but actual leadership skills are honed with practice. I like using the analogy that when you learned how to drive a car, you might have, learned in the classroom first, and then you were given a set of keys to go around a parking lot, to practice in a parking lot before hitting roads, and maybe hitting the back roads before you hit major roads, and you graduate to being able to drive on a freeway. Well, you're not given just a set of keys without learning the academic side of it and then doing practice runs, before hitting the freeway. That would just be a recipe for disaster. And the same thing is true of leadership skills, where you can learn them academically, but then practice them in smaller, less impactful opportunities and grow in those leadership skills to be able to lead larger teams and have more responsibility while you do that. Another way to do this is by asking for stretch assignments. So some of the fastest growth comes from projects that are slightly beyond our current comfort zone. And you just talked a little bit about being in discomfort as well. But examples of this are leading a cross-functional initiative outside of your current technical area. Managing a critical customer relationship. Boy, if that goes south, you'll know. And so you'll want to learn how to manage customer relationships effectively as you grow in your career. Presenting to executives. This is something that we'll get into a little bit further, but that's also a skill that is can be very uncomfortable, especially when you're first doing it, but also gives you exposure to, senior leadership and how they think and what they care about, but also gives you the opportunity to learn how to verbally influence and get resources that you would have otherwise not been able to get, and so forth. So presenting to executives is another skill that we really recommend as a stretch assignment. Maybe take ownership of a project that's struggling so that you learn how to get something that's off the rails back on the rails. And that will give you some exposure as well, especially to senior leadership. And then also participate in organizational change efforts. One that we had in our organization when you and I were both still a part of it, as an example, we had a million of them throughout our careers, but one towards the end was this idea about culture and change and how our values were, do we need to update those and so forth. And that was important for the entire organization. And so we were seeking people who would otherwise not be exposed to be a part of those stretch assignments to help influence the future of the organization. And that's a great opportunity to raise your hand and get involved. These experiences expose you to ambiguity that you otherwise aren't exposed to in your job that you have been able to come in and do day in and day out. And it helps you build credibility as being somebody who can tackle more complex and more cross-functional projects.
So undoubtedly so. We were talking about, or you were talking about the fact that, this is where some of your fastest growth comes from. I'd suggest this is where all your growth comes from. It's taking on new responsibilities and new experiences. If you're doing the same thing day in and day out, you might be doing it extremely well, but I'm not sure you're growing a lot. And I'm not taking it away from your technical competence, but if you're not doing things that you haven't done before, you ain't growing. So along those lines, though, so now you take on these other opportunities and these new challenges. Along the way, you need to be asking for regular developmental feedback. Instead of just saying, how am I doing? I maybe suggest, so when you're asking the questions, what would someone at the next level do differently than the way I'm doing things right now? What skill is most likely to limit my advancement? And what's one responsibility I could start taking on now? So the specific feedback is usually much more actionable than a general praise or general commentary you could get. And so if we dive in a little bit further on feedback, we actually like the model that's employed by Manager Tools, a company we've advocated for a number of times here. They provide training on how to be an effective manager and communicator. They believe in weekly one-on-one feedback from your boss. Weekly. I'm foot stomping it because they have a recent podcast on the difference in effectiveness between weekly and monthly, and it's striking. So weekly one-on-one feedback, allowing for time to give you an update and for them to give feedback on what's going on well and what they'd like you to work on, and then some time for jointly coming up with what's next. That's what the one-on-ones are about. And it's 30 minutes. It's not like you spend your entire work week doing these things. You do, by their guidance, a 30-minute session to take these things on, but on a very, very regular basis. Certainly that's the ideal model, but without that opportunity, asking for feedback ad hoc is better than not. Just remember that feedback is always a gift.
It sure is. It's the gift that when you ask for it, keeps on giving, because you'll grow, right?
Yep.
And as you're doing that, by the way, and as you're asking for feedback, that is also one way that you're building communication skills, which is another key skill that you and I recommend if you're growing in your career, especially early on. This is another one of those skills that doesn't just happen by chance or by reading a book. It is honed with learning new communication skills and practicing those skills. And as you move up the chain, your people skills become more and more a part of your job, more so than your technical abilities or the primary skill set you have as an individual contributor. And so because of that, because communication becomes a larger part of the job, work on, again, those executive presentations, being able to articulate your vision, your requirements, your hurdles, and the options that you have to overcome them in an effective way to the executive team means you have an advantage to resources and funding those efforts than those who aren't doing that effectively. If you want to get better before standing in front of an executive audience, consider joining Toastmasters. Bill, I haven't ever asked you, did you ever join Toastmasters?
I did not ever do actual Toastmasters. I certainly have had presentation courses and got to do lots of practicing. I sponsored Toastmasters as the boss many, many times, but I never actually got to join Toastmasters.
Yeah, I'm the same. I had plenty of opportunities outside of Toastmasters, but if I hadn't had those opportunities, you bet I would have joined. You bet I would have been a member of my local chapter and learned.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if it had something to do with both of our early careers where we got to do presentations whether we wanted to or not and got lots and lots of feedback in those early days. But not every domain, certainly not every industry has those kinds of opportunities unless you sort of force the issue through something like a Toastmasters operation that forces you to say, I'm going to give briefs and I'm going to get some real actionable feedback from those.
That's right. That's right. Another piece, not just in briefing executives, but also writing clearly. Just as with delivering briefs, articulating your updates, your concerns, your challenges, your wins in writing prepares you to advance quickly as well. So does storytelling with data. I love this concept because storytelling is such an important part of the job. Not only does it help you communicate up the chain of command, it is also a motivational tool for the rest of the team. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, be able to talk about the end users of whatever it is that you're building and why the work that you're doing is important to support those end users. That's really motivational for the rest of the team. In addition to that, negotiation is another key skill set to learn. So you're going to want to advocate for resources, to leverage another talented person's time on your project, even if it's just for a short task. You're going to want to negotiate your own next steps. So learn about negotiation. For example, there's a book called Never Split the Difference that is highly recommended on learning the skills of negotiation and how to be most effective at it. Read that book and then practice those skills. You and I have hit on active listening a number of times so far throughout our podcast, and will continue to do so because it's such a foundational skill. It's so important to listen to hear, and it is more important to listen to hear than it is to be understood, right? Like we've talked about. It has an impact on your relationships up the chain of command, with your subordinates, and with your peers. The importance of this skill cannot be overstated, and it's one that you and I just continue to harp on as being fundamental as you grow in your career.
Yeah, I'm just gonna jump in just for a second, just because I think it's important. You said listen to hear. I'm going to fall back to my buddy Stephen Covey and say, seek first to understand. You're not, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but it's not just hearing other people talk. It's listening for understanding without judgment, trying to understand why they're saying what they're saying and where they're coming from. It applies in a number of areas that we've talked about in this very podcast, but we certainly have talked about this as a foundational skill for dealing with anybody around you, bosses, subordinates, peers, family members, on and on and on. This is a skill that you can't skip over.
Absolutely. I heard and understood you, Bill.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then when you also get to the next level of communication skills, adapting your communication style to different audiences and different individuals just makes you even more effective. And the way to do this is by learning how to read personalities, to learn how to communicate most effectively with whom. For example, the DISC profile highlights if a person is more dominant, if they're more influential, conscientious, or steady. And there's specific definitions for each of those, for being dominant, for being influential, for being conscientious, and for being steady. If you learn the DISC model, you'll be able to see how they converse, their body language, the cadence they use, even the words they use, and determine their primary communication skill or style, excuse me. When you understand this, you'll be much more effective. So for example, a highly conscientious person is one that loves to check boxes. So they are less interested in personal connection and more interested in getting stuff done. So while it's important to build relationships, this person is going to be more comfortable with less conversation about their weekend, more than identifying the biggest priorities for the week.
So what I hear you saying is that, Bill, you don't fit into this category. But
You are not, no, Bill, you are not a high C.
Yeah, I'm clear. Okay, so another big piece as you're growing, if you're a new leader, is to gain cross-functional exposure. So understanding how different parts of the organization interact is just going to make you that much more effective as a leader. So you've got to look for opportunities to collaborate with the teams that are outside your particular specialty. Just like we discussed earlier, where you learn other parts of the business outside of your primary technical role, getting to work with different parts of the organization gives you a perspective. What are their pain points? What makes them tick? How do they integrate with your team? You know, it's easy to ignore what's not right in front of us. But when we, for example, start to understand all the operations team does to make sure we have a roof over our heads, or working restrooms, a strong IT infrastructure, building security, and all the foundations that allow us to do the work, we can learn to appreciate their data calls, their cost adjustments, or the time it takes to get the parts ordered. You know, and so that it's just fundamental. If you're going to be working in a broader influence role in your organization as you grow your leadership skills, you're going to have to understand how everybody else is working at that organization too, and it's going to make you much more effective. Additionally, as you're trying to grow your opportunities at an organization, you don't just want mentors, you also want to find sponsors or advocates. You know, the mentors are there to advise you. The sponsors actively advocate for you by recommending you for important projects, promotions, leadership opportunities. Certainly, you know, one person could be both mentor and sponsor, but they aren't always filled by a single individual. As a young professional in a medium or large organization, growing your influence in the organization is an important part of growing your leadership function long before you're actually being considered for leadership positions, right? And so I'm differentiating here. You can be a leader in an organization no matter what your official role is. When you find that you have followers for the ideas you have, that's leadership function that's going on, even if you're not the designated, you know, in writing leader. So in order to get there, you know, strong performance is the foundation, but building trust with senior leaders can increase the likelihood that they're going to champion your growth. You know, give the seniors a chance to see not only your technical prowess, but your ability to work well with teams, leadership. You know, let them see that your leadership in meetings and on projects, and you do that kind of stuff, you're going to have more advocates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one piece that I also really advocate for is actually building self-awareness in how you're showing up at work, right? Leadership development also includes understanding what are your own tendencies. Consider using structured feedback like 360-degree reviews if your organization offers them. Keep a record of lessons learned after major projects and reflect on what motivates your decisions under pressure. So I actually know a leader who every week at the end of the week would set aside an hour on his calendar to write in his leader log. It was essentially like a diary of what he found that went well throughout the week and what he wants to improve on the following week. And he did this week after week and did it for years and continues to advance in roles of higher seniority and responsibility. Bill, I recall you saying that you had a personality assessment that gave you insight you were previously aware of. What was that?
Yeah, so many people probably are aware of the Myers-Briggs evaluation criteria that tells you what your personality tendencies are. And so there's sort of a revelation. This is probably 20, maybe 30 years ago that I took this thing. And it was very, very valuable. And it was scary how right on it was. One thing that sort of stands out in my mind was a comment that was evaluating me that said, "You are often surprised to hear that people think you're mad at them." And I was like, "What? Are you kidding me?" And see, I'm surprised about it now. And it happened 30 years ago. The answer is that I get passionate about stuff. And so when I lean into that passion, not everybody communicates exactly the same way as we've been discussing. And so my passion sometimes was taken as me being angry at the person I'm talking to. And I'd like to say that I got over that. And I certainly made a much more conscious effort to be aware of that when I was talking to people. As I got passionate, I would remind them, I'm not mad at you. I'm just really into this conversation. Last week, when I was talking to my current boss, he turned to me and goes, with a big smile on his face, "Bill, why are you yelling at me?" It's like, I don't think I was yelling at you, but I am passionate about this topic. So this being a discussion about building self-awareness, it is absolutely critical that you get some evaluation, the 360-degree reviews are great from your peers and your bosses and your subordinates, but also the individual evaluations that help you get real reflection on how you approach life, how you communicate, how you work with a team. This is invaluable.
This is where you can really, truly say, it's not you, it's me.
Often. I get to say that a lot. We've talked about a lot of the personal skill stuff, but there's another piece that sometimes if you're listening to what we just talked about and you're a young professional, you may say, "You mean I don't have to have any technical competence when I move up the chain?" Maybe that's the problem. And so I want to be clear that we're not saying that you don't have to have technical competence as you move up the chain. In fact, you've got to be able to maintain at least technical credibility with your teams while you're broadening that perspective. So, early in your career, your technical expertise is often the differentiator. But as you move into leadership, you're likely going to spend more time coordinating, making decisions, and developing other folks. And you need to be able to continue to understand the technical work, even if you're no longer doing all of it yourself. And that's going to help you make informed decisions and maintain the credibility with your team. One of the greatest things that ever was said to me was one of the most technical people in the organization coming to me and briefing me on a new effort and saying, "Bill, I always know you're going to ask the hard questions," because I was trying to maintain a credibility even though I wasn't building the devices or building the systems myself. I tried to maintain the technical credibility that I could ask purposeful and insightful questions that would help us advance the project that much more. And so that technical credibility is just critical as you continue to grow in the organization. So one practical way to guide your development is to ask your manager or your mentor, "If I were preparing for the role 2 levels above mine over the next 3 years, what experiences should I deliberately seek out?" And that conversation is going to often lead to concrete opportunities that are going to align your development with whatever the organization needs.
Yeah. We've talked throughout this episode about people basically not only staying relevant in their technical expertise, but also getting breadth of knowledge across the organization, across the different elements that make a business run. And that's all inherently part of growth as a leader. We also talked a lot about growth in more of those power skills, like being a more effective communicator and leadership and delegation and all of those skills that need to come with practice, especially when you're learning how to lead people effectively. One piece that we didn't address yet that I want to make sure we do so before we close up is also a mindset that says that if you're identified early in your career as being a future leader, do not expect to have all the answers. One of the things, when circling back to the team that I was working with, some of these young professionals that were within 4 years of their career starting had this expectation that they needed to know how to solve the same problems that the people with 20, 30 years of experience knew how to solve. And if they didn't, showing the vulnerability to actually ask for help was something that they really had to get mindset to overcome. And the folks with 20 and 30 years of experience made it adamant that no, we do not expect you to have all the answers. We expect to help you through this process and help you grow. And that's a mindset shift that I hope that young professionals, especially ones that are identified to be future leaders, really embrace, that you are not expected to be the smartest person in the room. As you mentioned, you will never be the smartest person in the room, or having the attitude that you're not the smartest person in the room will really help you advance and help you lean on the team that's around you, that really not only early in your career, but all the way through till the day you retire, making sure you leverage the people that have the skill set that you just don't have yet, and ask a lot of questions really goes a long way in developing yourself as a leader and developing the team around you. What did I miss, Bill?
So I would add on one small piece to what you were just talking about. Obviously, we started out in the first minute, we said, try not to presume you're the smartest person in the room. And sometimes for very, very technically competent people, they may be in the room and they say, I already know that I actually am the smartest person in this particular room. That might even be true at some level, but you miss opportunities if you still don't ask questions, if you still don't let the team help you decide what's going to happen. If you are convinced you probably have the right answer already, you're probably going to learn a whole lot by still allowing the team to answer questions and come to those conclusions with you, as opposed to you delivering that as the final answer before you have a discussion. So I mean, it's more than just don't ever assume you're the smartest person, because sometimes the technical people, the extremely good technical folks may think, I already actually know that I have the better ideas than other folks. It's important as you go in that leadership role to not approach it that you are just going to give people the right answer and then expect that to go well every time. So I don't want to let that pass. Even if you think you are the smartest person in the room, ask the questions anyway.
Well said. Well said. All right, Bill, bring us home.
Okay. Well, if we don't have anything else to add, thank you for listening to this episode of Mentoring in Real Life. If you have thoughts or questions, feel free to leave us a comment or send us an email, which we've included in the show notes. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, rate the podcast, and share it with a friend. Until next time, help others climb.